The sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a blood-orange glow over the remnants of the once thriving city of St. Augustine. The streets, once bustling with life, now lay eerily still. Buildings that were once filled with laughter and chaos now stood as hollow reminders of the world that had been. The wind whispered through broken windows, and in the distance, a faint rumble echoed through the silent air, though it wasn't the thunder of an incoming storm. No, it was something far more terrifying. The city had been ravaged by the undead for nearly 6 months now. The initial shock of the outbreak had passed, but what came next was the unrelenting wave of hunger. Zombies, horrific creatures driven by a ravenous need for flesh, had turned the world into a living nightmare. Survivors who had once lived in fear of the constant howls and moans of the undead were now numb, resigned to the fact that every day could be their last. But today, something was different. In the center of the city, a group of survivors had taken refuge inside a fortified church. They had heard the sounds of the zombies before, those haunting howls that pierced the night, the relentless pursuit of human flesh. But now, the silence was deafening. The wind swept through the cracked doors of the church, and even the trees outside stood motionless, as if holding their breath. It was the calm before the storm, but what storm was coming? Jacob, one of the last remaining survivors, stood by the window, peering through the gaps in the shattered glass. His eyes were sharp, his senses heightened, but all he could hear was the soft rustle of the wind. His heart raced, his mind whirring with questions. Why had the undead suddenly gone quiet? Where had the usual pack of howls and growls gone? His hand tightened around the rifle in his grip, a weapon that had once brought him comfort but now felt like a useless relic in a world where survival had become an art of evasion. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough from behind him. Sarah, a former nurse who had become a trusted ally during the past few months, stepped into the room. Her face was gaunt, her eyes filled with the same uncertainty that had clouded everyone's mind lately. "You hear that?" Jacob asked, his voice low and cautious. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the empty streets. "It's strange," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "The Horde's never been this quiet before. It's almost like they're waiting for something." Jacob exhaled sharply, stepping away from the window. "I don't like it," he muttered. "Not one bit." In the back of the church, the other survivors had gathered. Marcus, a former soldier, was checking the barricades once more, his movements precise and controlled. He'd been the one who insisted on fortifying their position when the first signs of the Horde began to grow stronger. Now, as he glanced at Jacob and Sarah, there was a weariness in his eyes, a fatigue that went beyond the physical. The silent night was starting to feel like a trap, and Marcus couldn't shake the sense that the calm before them was not a blessing, but a warning. "What do you think?" Marcus asked, stepping toward Jacob and Sarah. "Do we wait, or do we go?" "We can't just sit here and hope for the best," Jacob replied. "If the Horde isn't moving, it could mean they're regrouping. We need to find out why they've stopped. It could be a trap." Sarah nodded in agreement. "If they've stopped because they've found a new source of food, we need to know where. If we're not careful, we'll be the next meal." Jacob sighed and turned back to the window, his eyes searching the horizon. The last few weeks had been filled with constant movement, constant fear. But this was something different. This silence, this unnatural calm, it wasn't the world he had grown used to. It felt like something far worse was looming on the horizon, something even more terrifying than the undead that had once been a constant presence in their lives. The night dragged on, and the silence pressed against them, suffocating in its intensity. As the clock ticked on, the survivors found themselves locked in a tense standoff with time. Should they stay and wait for the inevitable storm of undead to return, or should they venture out into the unknown and risk everything to learn the cause of the eerie stillness? But in the back of their minds, one question lingered: what if the howls had gone quiet for good? The answer to that question would shape their fate, but in that moment, none of them had any idea what horrors awaited them in the darkened streets beyond the church's crumbling walls. As the night deepened, the world outside remained still, but inside the church, the weight of uncertainty hung over them all, thick and suffocating. The stillness of the night persisted, each passing moment stretching longer than the last. Inside the church, the air felt thick with tension. The survivors, Jacob, Sarah, Marcus, and the others, had settled into an uneasy silence, their eyes darting nervously toward the door with every creak of the old wood. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. As the hours dragged on, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The zombies, once relentless in their pursuit of human flesh, had become a haunting echo. He remembered the first time he'd seen the Horde, how their growls, moans, and snarls filled the streets like a wave crashing against the shore. It had been deafening, terrifying, unstoppable. But now there was nothing. Just the distant hum of the wind and the occasional rustle of debris in the streets. "Do you think we're safe?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, pulling Jacob from his thoughts. Jacob shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Something's not right. It's too quiet. The Horde doesn't stop like this unless there's something they're after. We have to find out what it is." Sarah, ever the pragmatist, crossed her arms. "And if we go out there and it's a trap? Then we fight," Marcus spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "We've got no choice. We can't stay in here forever." The rest of the survivors nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim determination. There was no good option, no easy choice. Staying meant waiting for an inevitable attack. But venturing out into the unknown was a gamble, one that could cost them everything. Jacob glanced back out the window, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his shoulder. "We'll go at first light. We need to move fast and stay low. Keep your heads down and your ears open. If this is a trap, we won't see them coming until it's too late." Sarah, ever the healer, seemed lost in thought. "You're right. The hunger's returned for us, but I have a feeling it's not just the undead that we have to worry about anymore. Let's just hope it's not a new kind of monster," Marcus muttered darkly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the barricades one last time. "I've seen too many things that defy logic these days." The hours of silence continued, thick and oppressive, until the first light of dawn finally broke through the cracks in the church's walls. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the flickering shadows that danced along the edges of the room. It was a new day, but it felt like nothing was new at all. "Time to move," Jacob said, his voice steady but laced with the unease he felt deep in his bones. "Grab your gear, and let's go." The survivors gathered their things, checking their weapons and making sure they had enough supplies to last them through whatever awaited them outside. The fortified church, which had once seemed like their sanctuary, now felt more like a prison. It wasn't the Horde they feared, it was the unknown. Stepping cautiously through the church's front doors, Jacob was hit by the smell of rot and decay. The air was thick with dust, and the once bustling streets lay in ruin, like a forgotten city from a bygone era. The wind had picked up again, howling through the broken buildings and scattered debris. But there was still no sign of movement, no undead staggering through the streets. It was as if the city had been abandoned entirely. "Stay sharp," Jacob whispered to the others, his senses heightened. "Keep your eyes open. We're not alone." The group moved cautiously, staying close together as they navigated the ruined city. Every alley, every shadow, seemed to hold a threat, but there was no sign of the Horde. It was as if they had vanished. But then, as they neared a collapsed building, the silence was shattered. A faint sound reached their ears, a rustling, a shuffling. It was low, almost inaudible, but it was enough to stop them in their tracks. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Jacob nodded slowly, motioning for them to stop. They crouched low, moving quietly through the debris, until they came to a clearing. And there, in the middle of the street, was something they had never expected to see, a single zombie, crouched on the ground, tearing at the remains of a dead animal. The creature's eyes were glazed and unfocused, its once ferocious movements slowed by the act of feeding. But as it tore into the carcass, something strange happened. It paused, its head jerking up as if sensing something was wrong. It sniffed the air, then let out a low, guttural moan. Jacob's heart raced. This was the first sign of life they'd seen in hours, and it wasn't a good one. The zombie's hunger had returned, but it wasn't just after human flesh. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus whispered, his grip tightening on his weapon. Before anyone could respond, the sound of more shuffling filled the air. The street around them seemed to come alive, and suddenly, the quiet was broken. The silence had ended, but not with the return of the horde. No, it was worse. The hunger had returned. And it was more terrifying than they could have imagined. Jacob's eyes widened in realization. The horde wasn't gone, they were changing. And whatever they were becoming, it was something even more dangerous than the monsters they had already been. The street seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as the lone zombie, still crouched on the ground, sniffed the air again. It was a grotesque sight, its body decayed, half flesh and half bone, gnawing at the carcass of an animal like it was starving. But something about it was different. The movement was too precise, too deliberate. It wasn't the wild, mindless hunger they were used to. This was something else. The other survivors stayed frozen, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jacob's mind raced. He could feel the tension building, the air thick with the promise of danger. They had come this far, only to stumble upon a new kind of terror. A more intelligent terror. "Move back," Marcus whispered, barely audible as he pulled Jacob's arm. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." But it was too late. The zombie's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto the group as it let out a low, throaty growl. It wasn't the usual moan they had heard countless times before, it was a growl, more animal than human. And worse yet, it wasn't alone. From the shadows of the collapsed building, more figures emerged. One by one, they shuffled into view, zombies, but not the same mindless husks they had fought off for months. These creatures moved with purpose, their senses heightened, their bodies more attuned to the environment around them. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. "We need to go. Now." He didn't have to say it twice. The survivors turned and bolted down the street, their feet pounding against the cracked pavement. But they couldn't outrun the horde. The zombies were following them, moving with unnerving speed. They had been the hunted for so long, but now the tables had turned. The tables were turning faster than any of them could process. Jacob glanced over his shoulder, just in time to see the lead zombie break into a full sprint. It was faster than any zombie had any right to be. It didn't lurch and stumble like the others. It ran, and with a terrifying speed that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. "We need to split up," Jacob yelled, his voice hoarse with panic. "Head for the alleyways. Stay together, but spread out." The group broke apart, scattering in different directions, but Jacob's mind was spinning. This wasn't just a new breed of zombie, it was something far worse. It was almost as if they had evolved, adapted to a world that had once been their hunting ground. The hunger that had driven them for months now seemed more refined, more insidious. The evolution wasn't just physical, it was mental. He barely had time to process the thought before he was forced to dive behind a rusted car as one of the zombies came charging toward him, its movements fluid and calculated. The sound of its rapid breathing, like the heavy panting of an animal, filled the air as it closed the distance between them. Jacob's rifle went off in a quick, sharp burst, the sound deafening in the still morning air. The shot struck the zombie in the shoulder, but it didn't stumble. It didn't fall. Instead, it let out a shriek, a human-like scream filled with rage. It was a sound that sent a chill straight down Jacob's spine. "Jacob!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, and he could hear her coming toward him. But the horde was closing in from all sides now. They had no time. The feeling of being cornered, of being hunted, was all too familiar. Jacob scrambled to his feet, barely able to reload before another zombie lunged at him from behind. He threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's snapping teeth. The beast crashed into the side of the car with a sickening thud. Jacob didn't stop to look. He was already on his feet again, darting around the corner of the building. He turned to see Sarah and the others making their way toward him, but Marcus was lagging behind. His face was twisted in pain, and blood was dripping from his leg. The injury was bad, too bad to ignore. Jacob's stomach churned, but there was no time to help. The others would have to carry on without him. "Get to the roof!" Jacob shouted. "Now!" Without waiting to see if they'd followed, he ran, sprinting toward the fire escape of an old apartment building. His lungs burned, and his legs ached, but the sound of the zombies' pursuit was growing louder. He had no choice. If he didn't get to higher ground, he and the others were finished. Just as he reached the fire escape, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of snapping bones. One of the zombies had caught up to Marcus. The soldier's scream was cut short by the sickening sound of his body being torn apart. It was a horrifying sound, and Jacob felt it reverberate in his chest like an echo from the past. But there was no time to mourn. He had to survive. The others needed him. As he climbed the fire escape, he caught a glimpse of Sarah, who was just a few steps behind him. Her face was pale, but she was determined. They couldn't afford to stop, not now, not ever. The horde was changing. And with that change came an even greater danger. The undead were no longer just mindless monsters. They were organized, relentless, and faster than ever before. Jacob finally reached the roof, pulling Sarah up with him just as the first zombie reached the bottom of the ladder. There was no more running now. The only choice left was to fight, and Jacob had a sinking feeling that this fight would be like nothing they'd ever faced before. The roof of the old apartment building offered no solace. It was as desolate as everything else in this decimated world, a barren wasteland of broken concrete and twisted metal. The skyline of St. Augustine, once a proud silhouette of modern life, now stood as an apocalyptic monument to what humanity had lost. Yet, despite the wreckage surrounding them, there was no denying one thing: the undead were closing in. Jacob stood at the edge of the roof, eyes scanning the streets below. The horde was no longer an indistinguishable mass of mindless flesh-eaters. These new zombies had intelligence, an eerie sense of coordination. He could see them moving through the streets with purpose, in some strange, almost organized formation, like predators hunting their prey. And it wasn't just that they were faster. They were learning. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice trembling with the same realization that had been gnawing at Jacob since they'd seen that first zombie with a shred of awareness in its eyes. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He was trying to think, trying to find a solution that didn't involve running headlong into a pack of smarter, faster zombies. But the truth was, he had no idea how they were going to survive this. The fire escape was a good idea, but now what? Marcus, though barely holding himself together, limped forward. His leg wound was slowing him down, badly. The blood had begun to pool in his boot, but his resolve was still strong. "We can't just wait for them to come up here. We'll be sitting ducks. We need to find another way out of the city," Jacob said, turning to face the others. "There's a network of tunnels beneath St. Augustine, old subway tunnels, sewers, and maintenance shafts. They used to be used for storm drainage. But we can't take the main routes. If the zombies are learning, they'll eventually figure out where we're going." Sarah's face tightened, her eyes scanning the horizon. "What's the alternative? Just sit here and wait to be surrounded?" Jacob bit his lip, his mind racing through possible escape routes, but nothing seemed viable. The streets were crawling with the evolved zombies. And there was no telling how long it would take before the smart zombies found a way to reach the rooftops. The quiet might have been unsettling before, but now the silence only felt like the calm before the storm. Suddenly, an unsettling sound pierced the air, a strange, hissing screech that had no human origin. It was loud, high-pitched, and seemed to echo across the empty streets, sending a ripple of unease through the survivors. Jacob's stomach dropped. The sound was not coming from the zombies, but from something different. What was that? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's eyes darted toward the sound, instinctively raising his rifle to his chest. The screech came again, this time closer, so close that he could feel the vibrations in the air. It wasn't the sound of the zombies hunting, nor the usual guttural growls. This was something else. They've adapted, Jacob muttered to himself. But not just the zombies. What do you mean? Marcus asked, still struggling to stay on his feet. They're evolving, but so are we, Jacob said slowly, his voice filled with an unsettling realization. The infection isn't just about the zombies anymore. It's affecting us too. Sarah's brow furrowed. Are you saying, we're becoming like them? Jacob hesitated. No, not exactly. But the infection. It changes everything. It's mutating. Some of us might start seeing things we can't explain. The hunger, it's not just a physical need anymore. It's like it's rewiring our minds, too. Sarah looked at him, disbelief and fear mixing in her expression. You're talking about us becoming monsters. Jacob shook his head. No, I don't think it's that simple. I think the virus has been in a constant state of flux. The way we're seeing these zombies change, maybe they're evolving faster because the infection isn't just in their bodies. It's in everything. A sudden crash interrupted their conversation. Jacob whipped around to see a horde of zombies bursting from an alley below, their movements more coordinated than ever. They were forming a barricade, an almost human-like strategy. And then, as if on command, they began to scale the fire escape. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He had no time to waste. The zombies were faster, smarter, and now, they were on the roof with them. We need to move, he shouted, his voice urgent. This is our last chance. The group scrambled for the nearest exit, a crumbling maintenance ladder leading to another building across the alley. The screeching continued behind them, louder now, as if the creatures were right on their heels. Go, go, go. Jacob urged, his breath coming faster as he made his way up the rickety ladder. The others followed, Sarah pushing Marcus forward despite his injury. Jacob glanced back to see the first of the zombies lurching onto the roof, their movements more fluid than ever before. They weren't just mindless monsters anymore. They were learning. And whatever came next, Jacob knew one thing for sure, they weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for control. He reached the top of the ladder, pulling himself up into the next building. His breath came in ragged gasps. When he turned to see the others following, his eyes widened in horror. They weren't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, more zombies. But these weren't the fast-moving, coordinated ones they had seen earlier. These were different. They were tall, their eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. They were more human-like than anything Jacob had seen before. And in that moment, Jacob realized the true extent of what the infection had done. The evolved zombies were no longer just predators. They were evolving into something that wasn't entirely dead, or entirely alive. We've got to fight, Jacob said, his voice grim. But we need a plan. They're getting smarter, and we're not going to make it out of this if we keep reacting. We have to outsmart them. Sarah and Marcus nodded, the weight of their reality sinking in. The evolution of the hunger had taken them all into uncharted territory, and now survival was no longer just about fighting the undead. It was about facing something far worse, the monsters they were all becoming. The horde was closing in. And Jacob realized the only way out of this nightmare was to face the monsters, head-on. The air was thick with tension, a quiet but dangerous hum that vibrated through the walls of the abandoned building. The mutated zombies, their glowing eyes piercing the shadows, stared at Jacob and the others with an unsettling level of awareness. Their movements were not just driven by instinct anymore, they were calculating, strategic, and disturbingly intelligent. Jacob could feel his pulse thumping in his throat. The terrifying realization that they were not facing mere undead anymore, but creatures that had evolved, that had adapted to this world, gnawed at him. They weren't simply predators, they were hunters. And now, the line between the living and the dead had blurred completely. "Stay calm," Jacob muttered under his breath, trying to steady his nerves as he scanned the room for any potential weapons. His rifle felt heavier in his hands, the weight of it no longer offering the comfort it once did. They needed more than just firepower now, they needed a plan. They needed to outsmart these monsters. Sarah, breathing heavily, moved to Jacob's side. "What do we do now? There's no way out, not with them here." Her voice trembled, but it was more than fear, it was exhaustion. The past few days had been nothing but running, surviving, and fighting. Jacob knew it was starting to break them. They were all nearing their breaking point. Their bodies were bruised, bloodied, and beyond exhausted. But their minds, those were starting to crack under the pressure of this new, horrifying reality. "We keep moving," Jacob said, though he didn't believe it himself. "We don't stop. We'll find another way." Marcus, his leg still leaking blood, leaned against a cracked wall, struggling to stay upright. "What other way, Jacob? There's no escape anymore. The whole city's crawling with them. And these new ones," he stopped, eyes flicking to the glowing eyes of the evolved zombies, "they're not like the others. They're not just a threat to our lives. They're a threat to our sanity." Jacob's stomach clenched as he nodded. He understood. The mutations weren't just biological, they were psychological. If the zombies could adapt this much, how long before their own minds started to bend, too? Could they hold on to their humanity for much longer? The glowing-eyed zombies moved slowly toward them, their steps deliberate, as though they were savoring the moment. Unlike the frenzied movements of the original horde, these new creatures seemed almost patient, like predators stalking their prey, aware that time was on their side. "Can we fight them?" Sarah whispered, her hand trembling as she clutched the knife she had scavenged earlier. The fear in her voice was evident, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there when they first met. Jacob shook his head. "I don't think we can. Not like this. Not unless we can find a way to break their pattern, confuse them." Sarah's eyes hardened. "Then we'll make our own pattern." It was a dangerous idea. Jacob wasn't sure it would work, but they had no choice. The zombies were evolving faster than they could react. If they didn't find a way to outsmart them, they were going to be outmatched, outclassed, and wiped off the face of the earth. "We need to separate them," Jacob said, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. "We draw them in and scatter. The building's old, and the layout's a maze. We use that to our advantage." "But they're learning," Marcus countered. "They've already seen us. They'll figure out the maze." "Maybe," Jacob said, a spark of defiance in his eyes. "But they haven't seen everything we can do. We'll use the environment. Create distractions, set traps. We've got to think like them. Stay one step ahead." The sound of the creature's eerie growls intensified. The zombies were getting closer, their unnatural movements filling the space with a growing sense of dread. The survivors exchanged tense glances, the unspoken agreement between them clear: it was now or never. Jacob quickly scanned the room, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool to help them escape. His gaze fell on a set of old pipes running along the wall. They weren't much, but they could be useful. "Sarah, Marcus, I need you to create a diversion, Jacob ordered. I'm going to try something. You two need to keep them occupied while I get to the maintenance room. I'll find something we can use. Sarah's lips tightened into a thin line, but she nodded, determination setting in. Marcus, despite his injury, gritted his teeth and gave a brief nod. I'll do my part, Sarah said, already moving toward the broken door at the far end of the room. Jacob hurried to the wall of pipes, pulling out a small utility knife from his pack. He sliced through a few of the rusted pipes, causing a loud, screeching sound that echoed through the room. It wasn't enough to draw the zombies toward them, but it was enough to get their attention. Meanwhile, Sarah and Marcus moved toward the opposite side of the room, trying to remain as quiet as possible while positioning themselves for the upcoming distraction. Every sound they made seemed to echo through the empty building. The zombies were getting closer, their movements synchronized, like a well-oiled machine. Jacob's mind raced. This wasn't going to be easy. The evolved zombies weren't like the ones they had fought before. They were smarter, faster, and more methodical. But Jacob had no other choice. They had to take the risk. They had to hope that they could outsmart the monsters they were becoming. Then, without warning, Sarah slammed a metal pipe onto the floor, sending a resounding crash reverberating through the room. The zombies' heads snapped in unison, their eyes locking onto her position. Now! Jacob shouted. He sprinted toward the maintenance room door, the others following suit. The zombies, distracted by the noise, began moving toward Sarah and Marcus. Jacob's heart raced as he pushed open the door and slammed it behind him, plunging into the darkness beyond. The room was cold and damp, and Jacob could barely make out the shapes of old machinery in the dim light. But he wasn't here for the machinery, he was here for a way out. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a fire escape route leading down into the tunnels below. It was their only hope. But as he moved toward the door, a sound froze him in his tracks. The eerie screeching echoed once more, followed by a low growl, closer now. The evolved zombies were hunting them, and it wasn't just their bodies that were in danger. It was their minds. Jacob glanced back at the others, his voice barely a whisper. We've got to hurry. They're coming. And if we don't get out now, we won't be able to escape the monsters we've become. The fire escape door slammed shut behind Jacob, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. He gasped for air, his chest tight as the distant screeches of the evolved zombies reverberated through the old maintenance room. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, the walls covered in grime, remnants of a city that had once been alive. Now, it was a forgotten tomb. Jacob's mind raced. The fire escape below was their only real shot at surviving. The tunnels beneath the city, long abandoned by those who once used them for storm drainage and maintenance, were their last hope. The zombies were evolving faster than they could adapt. The time for running was over, now they had to outwit them, find a way to survive in a world that had turned against them. He quickly turned to Sarah and Marcus, who were just behind him, both of them gasping for breath, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Down there, Jacob said, pointing toward the darkened doorway that led to the narrow staircase descending into the unknown. It's the only way. Once we're in the tunnels, we can put some distance between us and them. They won't be able to track us down there. At least, not as easily. Marcus, clutching his leg where the blood had soaked through his pants, nodded but didn't speak. His strength was waning, but his will to survive was still there. Sarah, on the other hand, hesitated, her eyes flicking back to the door they had just come through. The sound of the zombies moving closer, their distorted screeches echoing louder now, sent a shiver down her spine. I don't like it, she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. It's dark down there. And if we get trapped? We don't have a choice, Jacob interjected, his voice firm. If we stay up here, we're dead. It's a risk, but it's the only chance we've got. Sarah clenched her fists, her expression hardening. Fine, she said, more to herself than to him. "But if we don't make it out of this, I'll never forgive you." Without waiting for a response, she stepped toward the fire escape, her footsteps quick and deliberate. Marcus followed, grimacing with each step but refusing to let the pain slow him down. Jacob followed last, his mind already racing ahead, plotting their next move. The tunnels would offer them some safety, at least temporarily. But the longer they stayed down there, the more time the zombies would have to evolve, to learn. If they didn't find a permanent solution soon, this could very well be the end. The moment they stepped into the dark, narrow stairwell, the air seemed to shift. It was colder here, and the smell of damp earth and stale water was overpowering. They had no light, only the distant sound of their footsteps and the occasional, eerie echo of the zombies' growls far above. Jacob pulled a flashlight from his pack, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. He led the way down the stairs, the others following closely behind. The old stone walls were covered in a slick layer of moss, and the concrete beneath their feet was slick with decades of neglect. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. "It's not meant to be cozy," Jacob replied, keeping his voice low. "We just need to keep moving." As they descended deeper into the tunnels, Jacob could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The Horde had evolved, become something more than they could have imagined, and they were running out of time. How long would it be before the evolved zombies figured out how to navigate the tunnels themselves? They reached the bottom of the stairs, where a narrow passage stretched before them. Jacob led them into the tunnel, his flashlight casting strange shadows on the walls. The air grew heavier as they moved deeper, the oppressive silence threatening to suffocate them. They passed old, rusted pipes and broken doors, remnants of a world that had once been alive and thriving. Now, it was a tomb, its secrets buried beneath the city's ruins. "We need to find an exit," Jacob said, breaking the silence. "Somewhere above ground. The tunnels only go so far." "I know," Sarah replied. "But if we keep moving like this, we won't make it. We need to rest. I'm not sure how much further I can go." Jacob glanced back at her, his heart sinking. She was right. They were all exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached from the constant running, the fear, and the tension that had been building for days. But there was no time to rest. The zombies were evolving faster than they could process, and if they stayed in these tunnels for too long, they'd be trapped, cornered, and exposed. "We'll rest when we find a safe spot," Jacob said, his voice resolute. "For now, we keep moving." Marcus, despite his injuries, nodded in agreement. They had no other choice. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the oppressive darkness threatening to swallow them whole. The air grew colder, and the sound of dripping water echoed around them, making it feel as though the walls themselves were closing in. But still, they moved forward, driven by the need to survive. Hours passed, at least, it felt like hours, and they didn't stop once. The tunnel wound through the bowels of the city, passing through forgotten chambers and crumbling walls. Jacob felt like they were walking through the remnants of a lost world, one that had long since been forgotten by the living. Finally, they reached a junction where the tunnel split in two directions. The walls here were littered with old signs, faded and covered in grime. Jacob squinted at one of the signs, trying to make out the letters. It read "Emergency Exit." "This way," Jacob said, his heart leaping. "This leads up to the surface." The group hurried toward the exit, their pace quickening as hope flared in their chests. But as Jacob reached for the rusted door handle, a strange sound stopped him in his tracks, a sound that made his blood run cold. The screeching, echoing cries of the zombies, now far closer than before, reverberated through the tunnel, drowning out everything else. They were coming. They had found them. "No," Jacob whispered, fear clawing at his throat. "No, we can't let them find us." The mutated zombies had already evolved enough to track them, to understand their patterns. And now, it was clear, they were never going to be safe again. The door rattled in its frame as the first of the evolved zombies reached the entrance to the tunnels. They were trapped. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. They had to get out, but it seemed that the monsters weren't just after their lives anymore. They were after something deeper. Their humanity. The tunnel was no longer just a path to safety, it was their final battleground. The sounds of the zombies' growls, distorted and unnatural, echoed down the narrow passageways like the foreboding drumbeat of an inevitable fate. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, and every fiber of his being screamed to run, to escape, but there was nowhere left to go. The walls were closing in. The mutated zombies were hunting them. And the surface, the world above, seemed like an unreachable dream. Jacob's hand gripped the rusted door handle, his fingers slick with sweat. The pounding of his heart reverberated in his ears. He didn't know how much time they had. Seconds? Minutes? The terrifying realization was clear, they were out of time. But they had to make a choice, fight or die. Jacob. Sarah's voice was a mixture of urgency and panic, cutting through the tension that had thickened like a suffocating fog around them. We need to go now. Jacob turned, his mind still racing for a plan. The emergency exit was their only shot. The only way out was through the door, but it had been sealed for years. There was no guarantee it would open. No guarantee they could get through before the evolved zombies reached them. Marcus was leaning heavily against the wall, blood trickling from his leg, pale and drained. But there was a fire in his eyes, a determination to survive, to see this nightmare through to the end. It was the same fire that had kept them alive this long. Jacob's gaze locked onto Marcus's. Stay with me. We need to open that door. Marcus nodded, gritting his teeth through the pain. We either make it out, or we don't, he muttered. There's no middle ground anymore. The words were heavy, but they were true. There was no option for surrender, no chance for mercy in a world where mercy no longer existed. The zombies were evolving, becoming smarter, and no matter how hard they fought, they would never outrun them. Not without a plan. And right now, the only plan was survival. Without another word, Jacob pushed forward, his hand moving to the door handle, pulling with all his strength. But the door resisted, stuck in place by years of disuse and rust. Sweat trickled down his forehead, and his muscles burned from the exertion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Behind him, Sarah's voice quivered with panic. Jacob, hurry. They're close. He glanced over his shoulder. Through the shadows at the far end of the tunnel, he could see their glowing eyes. The mutated zombies were nearing, their movements faster, more precise, their hunting instincts in full gear. They knew where they were, knew they were trapped. It was only a matter of time before they closed in on their prey. Jacob's pulse quickened. There was no more time for struggling with the door. With a final, desperate yank, he wrenched the handle free, the door creaking open just enough to slip through. But just as the gap widened, a distant scream echoed through the tunnel. It was too late. The first of the evolved zombies had arrived. Go! Jacob shouted, shoving Sarah and Marcus ahead of him. Now! They rushed through the narrow opening into the next section, a dark, cramped space that smelled of decay and damp earth. The sound of their footsteps was deafening in the silence that followed, their movements quick and desperate. Behind them, the growling of the zombies grew louder, echoing through the tunnel with an eerie, guttural rhythm. The footsteps of the creatures were quickening, each step a reminder of the relentless pursuit closing in around them. Jacob's mind raced. There had to be another way out. There had to be. As they pushed forward, Jacob's flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, but he knew they couldn't keep running. They couldn't just outrun the zombies, they had to outsmart them. Up ahead. Sarah shouted, her voice breaking the silence. She pointed toward a ladder that led up to another grate, a chance at freedom. We can make it. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. This was their shot. But as they made their way toward the ladder, a loud, bone-chilling roar echoed behind them. The mutated zombies had entered the narrow tunnel. Their eyes burned with an unnatural hunger, their bodies a grotesque mix of human and something far worse. We won't make it, Marcus gasped, clutching his side as he limped behind them. We're not fast enough. They're too close. We will make it, Jacob said, his voice firm. We have to. They reached the ladder just as the first mutated zombie appeared at the entrance of the tunnel. The creature's glowing eyes fixed on them, and its mouth opened wide in a twisted mockery of a roar. It had evolved into something far more dangerous than the mindless flesh-eaters they had fought in the beginning. These things were predators, not simply animals driven by hunger. Climb! Jacob ordered, his voice hoarse as he pushed Sarah toward the ladder. Now, hurry! Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the ladder, her movements frantic, her breath ragged. Jacob followed right behind her, helping Marcus with one arm around his waist as they climbed, their hands raw from gripping the metal rungs. The sounds of the zombies grew closer, their horrific screeches filling the air, mixing with the sound of their own rapid breathing. Every second counted now. The creatures were close. Too close. They reached the top, and Sarah shoved the grate aside with a cry of relief, her hands trembling. But just as they were about to escape, a shadow fell over them. The lead mutated zombie, its glowing eyes now fixed on them, lunged toward the ladder. Go! Jacob yelled, his heart pounding in his throat. With one final push, they were through the grate, falling onto the ground above. Jacob helped Marcus climb out, then pulled the grate shut behind them just as the first of the zombies slammed into it with a deafening crash. The survivors were outside. They had escaped, barely. But as Jacob looked around at the desolate city that stretched before them, he realized the fight was far from over. The mutated zombies were no longer just a threat, they were a part of the world now. And this new world would never be the same again. We made it, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. But what now? Jacob's eyes scanned the city, the crumbling buildings, the deserted streets. The war was only just beginning. The fight isn't over, he said softly. Now we rebuild. Together. And with that, they stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The sky above them was gray, heavy with the promise of a storm. The city, once bustling with life and now decimated by the outbreak, stood in eerie silence. No traffic, no people, just the wind carrying the haunting echoes of a world lost. Jacob, Sarah, and Marcus stood together, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. They had made it out of the tunnels, but the world outside was just as unforgiving. The monsters they had narrowly escaped were still out there, evolving, and their fight for survival was far from over. Jacob looked around, his mind racing. What now? Where did they go from here? The zombies had spread across the globe, and it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, fighting for a future in a world that no longer made sense. He turned to Sarah and Marcus. Both were exhausted, their faces pale, eyes sunken from days of running and hiding. Marcus was still limping, his injury slowing him down, but he was alive. They were all alive. That was something, right? We need to move, Jacob said, his voice steady but urgent. The longer we stay in one place, the more we risk being discovered. Sarah nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow, her eyes scanning the horizon. Where do we go? We can't just keep running. There's no safety anymore. Marcus, his expression dark, spoke up. The world's changed. There's no going back. We can't pretend like we're just going to survive until everything's normal again. This is the new reality. Jacob nodded slowly, the truth of Marcus's words settling like a stone in his gut. He had known it all along, but hearing it out loud made it feel real, too real. "We need to regroup," Jacob said. "Find others, build a community. We can't fight this alone." The wind howled, and the distant screeching of the evolved zombies echoed through the empty streets. The Horde was out there, hunting, waiting. They had been silent for a while, but Jacob knew it was only a matter of time before they began to adapt even further. The zombies weren't just mindless flesh-eaters anymore, they were predators, and it would only get worse. A noise from behind them caught their attention, a distant rumble of thunder, followed by the faint sound of footsteps. Jacob's hand instinctively went to his weapon, his eyes scanning the area. The moment of peace had passed. They weren't alone. "Get ready," he whispered. But as the sound grew louder, a shape appeared in the distance, a figure, hunched over, dragging something behind them. Jacob's muscles tensed, ready to react, but as the figure drew closer, they froze. The person was dragging an injured companion behind them, and the expression on their face was not one of aggression, but one of exhaustion, desperation, and fear. The survivors stumbled forward, barely able to stand. "Please," they gasped, collapsing to their knees in front of the trio. "We need help." Jacob, Sarah, and Marcus exchanged wary glances. It was instinct to be cautious, but there was no time to hesitate. The zombies were closing in, and the last thing they needed was to be caught off guard. "Who are you?" Jacob asked, his voice low but steady. The survivor, a woman in her mid-30s, raised her hand, her face gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion. "My name is Leah," she said between breaths. "I was part of a group, but we were separated. We've been running, trying to find safety. Please, you have to help us. There's nowhere else to go." Jacob took a step closer, his mind working quickly. They didn't have much, but they couldn't turn someone away either. The world had changed, and now more than ever, it was about survival, together. "We're not going to leave you," Jacob said, his voice firm. "We'll help you, but we need to move. There's no time to waste." Leah nodded gratefully, tears welling in her eyes as she looked up at Jacob. "Thank you. Where's your group?" Sarah asked, stepping forward cautiously, looking down at the injured person Leah had been dragging. Leah's face twisted in pain as she looked away. "They're gone. We were ambushed. I couldn't save them." Her voice broke, and Jacob could hear the weight of her grief. Marcus stepped forward and crouched down beside the injured person. "We'll take care of your friend," he said softly. "But we need to go. Now." Leah nodded, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. Jacob felt a pang of empathy for her. She had lost so much, but somehow, she had survived. Just like them. They quickly helped Leah's companion, another man, younger than Marcus, but with injuries that had slowed him down. Together, they carefully moved through the deserted streets, staying alert, moving as quietly as possible. The city had once been full of life, full of promise, but now, it was a shell of what it had been. The sky darkened further, thick clouds rolling in as the storm began to break. As they made their way through the wreckage of the city, Jacob's mind kept wandering back to the same thought: what was left? They had survived the zombies' initial assault, but now the world was a fractured mess. People like them were scattered, struggling to survive. And though they had found each other, Jacob knew that this fragile alliance was just the beginning. There would be others out there, others who had survived the apocalypse. But the question was, would they be allies or enemies? "We're not alone," Jacob muttered under his breath as he glanced at his group, the weight of his words heavy. "No," Sarah said quietly, looking at the horizon where the silhouettes of more survivors could be seen moving across the ruined city. "But we won't be the only ones fighting for survival either." Leah's eyes flicked toward the others, and she nodded. "We're all in this together now." Jacob turned his gaze back to the horizon, the storm clouds gathering above. In the distance, the sound of thunder rumbled, and a soft, eerie howl echoed through the empty streets. The dawn was breaking, but it wasn't a dawn of hope. It was the dawn of a new world, one where survival was no longer just a matter of finding shelter, but finding meaning in the chaos. And in that world, they would have to fight harder than ever before. Together, they would rebuild, not just their lives, but the future.